Hello today. My name's Jonathan Torch. I'll be your host today. We have on with us running for sheriff, Councilor Mike Albano. Good to see you,
good to be with you. Good to be with you.
So we're getting down to the end of the campaign. What I'd first like to talk about, why'd you decide to run for sheriff?
Well, I've been involved in public life for many, many years, and I've served on the Springfield School Committee, City Council President, Mayor of Springfield for 8 years, and now as a member of the Governor's Council. But what some people don't know about Mike Albano is that in my prior public service life, I served as a probation officer in the Westfield District Court. I was appointed by 3 governors to the Massachusetts Parole Board, where I conducted parole hearings all across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Every single correctional institution and Bridgewater State Hospital, we conducted hearings. So I've been able to work with correction commissioners and develop public policy relative to corrections. As mayor, I oversaw a police department with Chief Paula Mirror, who I believe is one of the finest chiefs of police in America. 600-person police department where we obviously were involved in law enforcement, but we also did a lot of prevention things, prevention programs, and Chief Mirror was fantastic in terms of reaching out into the community because of the diverse nature of Springfield and reaching out and resolving some of the tensions that were between police and communities of color. And then as a member of the Governor's Council, I have the solemn responsibility of confirming judges, virtually lifetime positions, from the district court, the juvenile court, all the way to the Supreme Judicial Court. So if you take all of that criminal justice background, I count 32 years. If you take all of that elected office experience, I count 20 years. It's a good mix, and it's a good balance to be sheriff of Hampden County.
You have 2 obviously very respectable opponents you'll be facing off with in the Democratic primary and then obviously the general election. What makes you, for Democrats out there, for people that'll be voting in the Democratic primary, what do you think most qualifies you and puts you over the top between your 2 other worthy opponents?
They are worthy opponents, and I know both of them and consider Nick Kochi and Tom Ash friends. I think the difference is that while we both bring certain strengths to the field, to the campaign, that I offer that political experience. Whether you like it or not, the position of sheriff is political in nature. And having been to the State House for many years, first as a member of the school committee fighting for equal education opportunity money for our children, whether it was getting money for the Basketball Hall of Fame or the Civic Center, fighting for Shannon grants, our fair share of Shannon grants, which are law enforcement grants. Those are important factors when you're putting together a budget and when you're advocating for legislation. So I would take that experience and highlight that because it is a political position along with my administrative experience, and I do think that it is the right balance at this particular time because I've got a great working relationship with Governor Baker. I work with Lieutenant Governor every single Wednesday as a member of the Governor's Council. I've gotten to know and work with Charlie Baker. I find him to be an extraordinary governor. So that combination, I think, puts me at this particular time to be the right person to be sheriff of Hampden County.
So not only making that your qualifications, a lot of people obviously know what a sheriff does. It's obviously in law enforcement, but a lot of people aren't as directly affected to it. So when primary day comes up, when the general election day comes up, why should people not only consider voting for you, but also just vote in general in the sheriff's race?
Well, because of this issue, and I've made this a focus of my campaign, this opioid epidemic that we are facing now, we have lost 800 of our citizens just in Hampden County to the scourge of opioid addiction. I believe the sheriff can play an important role in development of programs to combat this public health crisis. What do I mean by that? Well, I want to take the power and the authority of the Office of Sheriff to Boston and to Washington to change laws. We've had treatment on demand in this state since 1976. If you have a problem, you can go to if you're arrested and charged, you can go to the courts and say, I have a substance abuse problem, I need help. That has been the model since 1976. Unfortunately, the legislature has not funded fully, at least in Western Massachusetts, the appropriate resources for beds, for treatment. So I want to turn the criminal justice model of dealing with opioid addiction into a medical model. I want to have all the necessary resources in place so you don't have to get arrested and you don't have to go to the Hampden County House of Correction to get treatment. And that really is what the policy is now. In the courts, in the criminal justice system, is really no place to treat addiction. So fundamentally, I want to make a difference and change the model to a medical model from a criminal justice model, get more people into treatment. That is prevention. That'll prevent crime as well, and I think that's the appropriate way. So the difference between me and my distinguished opponents is that I offer that campaign pledge in that proposal because I think it will make a difference. I know it'll make a difference to save lives.
Going on the opioid crisis, obviously that's probably the one issue that everybody's been most talking about. What do you see has been sort of maybe working so far and not working so far in the current administration, and then what do you want to adapt and develop, as you were sort of speaking to earlier, to combat the opioid crisis?
Well, I think the model itself of if you have a problem, there are methadone clinics, there are resources available, but it's difficult to get people into those services. I had an individual yesterday, a pastor that I was talking to, and one of the folks in his congregation had a substance abuse problem. He had to go to Brockton to get treatment in a Team Challenge program. Great program, he loved it, got the person in there, but that's my point. Why do you have to go to Brockton to get treatment? So what I want to do, instead of putting a correctional facility on Mill Street, I want to make that into a neighborhood health center where the neighborhood could get primary health care, and at the same time open up those beds, up to 200 beds, for those who have substance abuse problems, but not waiting until they get arrested or they're incarcerated. Allow them to go there first. The beds that are in Brockton would be in Springfield, and then we would have the so-called treatment on demand model that we've been talking about for decades. I think that's the fundamental difference. Everyone talks about it, but there is no plan of action by government to actually make it succeed.
So as a sheriff, you would be more of a looking at it on a medical perspective rather than, even if they're not criminalized, to make sure that they have a place to stay, they have the adequate bed system. That's what a Mike Albano administration would plan on doing.
Right, and that's exactly what I would do. But people would say, well, that's really not the role of the sheriff. See, I disagree with that. I fundamentally disagree with that. When you're preventing crime, that's the role of the sheriff. And at the same time, you're saving lives, more importantly. And I also want to do some other things relative to prevention. I was very active in attempting and actually saving the Dunbar Community Center. It's a great institution in the heart of Mason Square, which services a lot of kids and a lot of families. Had that gone out of business, which it came close to doing, we'd have lost an opportunity to service hundreds, not thousands of kids. That's a prevention program. That's a prevention program. You engage kids in education program, recreation program. You engage parents in life skills. Well, that's an important responsibility that we should all share and make sure that that is functional. So I want to expand prevention programs as well. People say, well, that's not the job of the sheriff. That's not the role of the sheriff. I disagree.
So Michael Albano administration, obviously you've been mayor in the past. You would work on developing more community programs and things at the local level to make sure that those prevention measures, that kids, that teens don't get addicted, and sort of stopping them before they have to get to the sheriff's office? Would that be a goal of yours?
I would, and that's why I want to tell you a little bit about the importance of the presidential election. When I was mayor, Bill Clinton was president, and whether you like Clinton or you don't like Clinton, he was very favorably inclined to cities like Springfield. So we had an awful lot of money for law enforcement, additional police officers, but we also had money for prevention programs. We had after-school programs for kids. We had recreation programs. We had midnight basketball. Some people say, why do you have midnight basketball? Those kids shouldn't be in bed. Well, it doesn't always work that way in a lot of places. So we had these programs that were available, mediation as I indicated, and they were very, very successful getting kids off the street, getting them into productive programs. That is a result of a Democratic administration, and there is a difference between Democratic administrations and and Republican administrations. So there's potentially a lot of money out there for these types of programs, depending on who becomes the next president of the United States.
Do you believe, well, not only do you believe if Hillary Clinton might become president, obviously some of the polls are showing that, but do you think Hillary Clinton administration would be if you do become sheriff, be very helpful to your help?
I don't think there's any question about it. And that is just a fundamental difference of philosophy of how presidents deal with cities. And sometimes it contrasts with who votes for who. But Democratic administrations, if you look back historically, going back to FDR, have been far favorable to cities than Republican administrations.
Going on to your current time now as Governor's Council, we've had a lot of judge vacancies. What would you say have been some of the successful things that have happened during that time tackling the opioid crisis? I know you talked about confirming judges. Have there been any judges that you've confirmed that can best tackle?
Well, virtually every judge that comes to us, the Governor's Council, 8-member council, has been inquiring of what the philosophy is of the judge relative to punishment, relative to rehabilitation, and the balance that goes from the juvenile court all the way to the Supreme Judicial Court. So we want to make sure that these judges, especially on the district court level and on the superior court level, have an understanding of opioid addiction, and that they would, in our view, the majority of us want treatment rather than incarceration. So we've been pretty steadfast in grilling those nominees that come before us to see what their philosophy is before we vote to confirm. I can tell you 99.9% believe, as I do, that this is a medical issue and not a matter for the criminal justice system.
We also have not only the opioid issue going on, but we also have the ballot initiative to possibly legalize pot. And would that, well, first of all, what is your opinion on the pot legalization? But second to that, do you believe the possible legalization of pot would hinder or hurt possibly combating opioid addictions across the board, or would it be no effect?
Well, let me answer the second part of the question first. I don't believe it will have any effect at all. I do not believe it's a gateway drug. And the fact of the matter is that marijuana essentially is legalized now. It's been decriminalized, so possession of up to an ounce of marijuana is a non-criminal offense. It's basically legal. We have medical marijuana. So getting back to the ballot initiative, since I believe it's basically legal now, except if you want to buy it or if you want to sell it, but you can possess it. So to me, as a public policy maker and one who deals in legislation, it doesn't make any sense to me. So I believe it should be regulated. Should it be taxed appropriately? I think the legislature, after this ballot question, should it pass, should get involved in terms of the marketing, the potency of the medication, of the drug, if you will. And that way we'll have some control over it, because there is no control over it now. You know, the criminal justice system has basically turned a blind eye to marijuana. Years ago, there used to be people charged with possession. You don't see that anymore. Very few people go, if any, go to jail for possession of. So really, in my view, it has become legalized essentially. Now, having said that, my opponents take a different position. I understand that. I respect them. The Mass Sheriff's Association has taken a position in opposition to the ballot question. Governor Baker has done the same. But I just believe it's there. We should regulate it and tax it accordingly, and use that tax money, earmark it for direct services for those who have addictions.
You now going to paid consultants. You and some of your other opponents had talked about how not only here but also in the debate you just held recently about the fact that there's, I believe, 20 or 23 paid consultants. And you talked about avoiding having those type of, not necessarily avoiding having paid consultants, but having those type of conflicts of interest. Obviously, right now, the current sheriff, Michael Ash, his brother is being hired and getting paid currently as a paid consultant. In terms of just hiring process in general, with paid consultants, what would a Mike Albano administration do differently that's not happening now, or that might be happening now that might need to stop?
The issue with Sheriff Ash on the consultants, of which there are now, I guess, 27, is that they're all retirees. They have retired after putting in their service to the Commonwealth, and now they're coming back on consulting contracts. Essentially, they are double dipping. The state auditor said that's It's not a good policy. So in the example of Jay Ash, the sheriff's brother, he makes $104,000 a year in retirement benefits, plus his health insurance, and then another $51,000 as he comes back and he works as a consultant. It's $155,000 a year for basically a part-time job. Hurts morale of the employees. It doesn't allow for advancement of employees. It's just a bad practice. Now, relative to consultants, I don't necessarily have a problem with consultants, but my understanding of consultants, it's for a short period of time, a transition period. So you're taking my job, for example. I might stay on for a period of 90 days to help you with the transition, but after 90 days, that should be the end of the contract. I've asked Senator Eric Lesser to file legislation, so this goes across the board, across the Commonwealth. Consultants should be in place no longer than 6 months, and that would have a legislative end to it, and I think that's the way to go. Jay Ash, for example, has been on the consulting payroll for 8 years now, which is way, way too long, and in my view, compromises the integrity of the consulting process.
Now, in terms of hiring at the Sheriff's Department, obviously you'll probably be tasked with hiring hundreds of people over your tenure. What is your plan for hiring them? I know many people think, in politics, well, the friends, the family, maybe the vendors, people that have direct connections to the candidates are usually the ones to get the jobs, and that probably to the regular person might tick them off. How would you go about hiring people?
Well, in this particular instance at the Sheriff's Department, there's no question that the perception and the reality of political hires is there. There's just no way around that. So what I have done is I said I'm not going to take any campaign contributions from anybody who has anything to do with the jail. Not the employees, not the attorneys that work there, not the outside vendors. So I have stayed away from that completely, not accepting any political campaign contributions, because there's the perception that if you contribute, you're likely to get a position or get a promotion. So I want to do away with that. The second thing is I'm not actively seeking any political endorsements, because in my view, it's far too political, at least the perception is, and I think the reality is too, that if you have somebody in political office that is supporting you, then you're going to have to take care of their constituents in terms of hiring. So I'm staying away from both of those. The idea is to get the best and the brightest, and to run it as a business would, in terms of getting the best people in the right positions to do the right thing for the people of Hampden County,
and not factoring in personal.
Try not to. When I was mayor, we had a civil service test that went on, and some people were opposed to civil service. And I'm not saying civil service is the panacea, but at least you had some results in front of you that a decision maker could make a final decision on. So I'm not saying we go civil service, but perhaps at least for the short time we bring in a personnel agency that does this professionally, goes through the applications for hire, goes through the applications and petitions for promotion, and then makes a decision based on that, outside totally the political arena.
Recently, obviously, referencing the debate again, they were talking about how, unfortunately, we've recently had male officers taping female strip searches, correct me if I'm wrong, and obviously now that that hasn't stopped, obviously, I'm sure nobody in the Sheriff's Department right now wanted that behavior to happen. How would a Mike Albano administration lead to crack down on anything like that happening again?
Well, the sheriff actually implemented public policy, that allowed for male correctional officers to video strip searches of women inmates at the women's facility in Chicopee. Absolutely bizarre in my view. There's no reason to videotape strip searches to begin with, but having male officers videotaping women is just unconscionable. Judge Ponsner of the United States District Court in Springfield found it to be unconstitutional, total violation of privacy. But taking that away, as bad as that is, the people that are incarcerated, many of the women had mental health issues and substance abuse issues and suffering from depression. So their first introduction to the correctional system is to be strip searched, videotaped, humiliated by just the policy itself, and then try and go on from there to recover and become rehabilitated and get back into programs. I find it to be egregious and a conflict of corrections philosophy. So I filed legislation to ban it, even though Judge Ponsner has ruled it to be unconstitutional, because you never know what's going to happen across the state. By the way, it costs the taxpayers $2.2 million between compensating the women for what they were through, and also, of course, the attorneys. So it's $2.2 million to the taxpayer in a policy that should have never been implemented from day one. So under my administration, that certainly
That type
would
of thing
not happen.
obviously wouldn't
Never.
happen, and you'd have more of a leadership style that wouldn't obviously see
it's
things like that.
Corrections is corrections, and I understand some say this is a national model. I call that practice a national disgrace.
So going, obviously now we're going to see the end of Michael Ash's time as sheriff, and during much of his time as sheriff, he also hosted an annual summer clam bake. Sort of a political function, but also a yearly thing to raise money and whatnot. As sheriff, do you plan on having a function of that nature hosted on behalf of the sheriff?
I do not, and I'll tell you why. And I went to those clam bakes meant over the years as elected official, as mayor. I was there, but during the last 6 years, we've lost 800 people in Hampden County to the opioid crisis, this public health crisis. And the idea of people congregating at a clam bake and the political establishment of Western Massachusetts and leaders in the correctional field kind of having a good old time just is contrary to what is going on when you're losing people almost on a daily basis. I just find it not appropriate. So I'm not going to have a clam bake. I'm not going to have a picnic until the real issues are resolved here in Hampden County, until there's an action plan to save lives. And if that ever happens, then maybe we'll go back to having a festive occasion. But I just think the visual of the political establishment meeting together, drinking beer and enjoying clams while people are dying is just contrary to my beliefs.
Going to some national issues now, we've obviously had a national story about race relations between police officers and law enforcement. And we've also seen some very unfortunate, tragic shootings take place by police, law enforcement, members of the law enforcement community. As sheriff, how do you work on, in the greater Springfield area and Hampden County, strengthening the relationship between law enforcement agencies and maybe African American leaders who might be hesitant of law enforcement agencies right now as they're seeing a lot of these terrible tragedies play out on a national stage?
Well, I had experience as mayor. Springfield has had a very difficult relationship between police and communities of color going back to the 1960s. When Mayor Ryan was there in 1965 or 66, there was an incident at the Octagon Lounge which involved allegations of police brutality, more than allegations. And at that time, incredibly, Henry Twiggs, Ray Jordan, and Ben Swan, three great leaders of the African American community, were out front of City Hall protesting the police brutality in Springfield. Mayor Ryan made the decision to go to Boston and bring out the National Guard. And it was not a pleasant scene in downtown Springfield. That one incident, and then the calling of the National Guard, has divided Springfield to this day in generations. So there's always been tension. So as mayor, it's very difficult work, by the way, reaching out, because there's a general mistrust, especially of communities of color, of the establishment. So part of Chief Mira's responsibilities was to go out and make those connections and try and develop policy that everyone could feel comfortable with. On my end of it, we did hiring. She was the first woman chief of police, but we also put more officers of color in supervisors' positions. We hired more people of color, more women, so that the police department reflected the community that we served. And it was very, very effective. As mayor, I went out almost on a regular Sunday basis talking to pastors and congregations in the communities of color, the Latino community as well, so that there was a connection between government and communities of color. I put more people on boards and commissions and authority, so that there was a place at the table to make decisions.
Yeah.
And I think that goes a long way. Make no mistake about it, what's going on right now, Black Lives Matter, is the civil rights issue of the day. You know, I've been involved in civil rights for a long time. from affirmative action, which I'm a supporter of, to marriage equality. I was one of the first in the nation to support marriage equality. We filed lawsuits to bring that to fruition. And now this issue, this is the civil rights issue of the day. Some politicians say all lives matter. Well, that's an easy way out. But the focus should be on right now that young African American men are being killed at the hands of white police officers. And we have to deal with it as a city, as a state, and as a country.
Do you see race relations, at least in the Springfield area, being better than in some of these other areas where we've had where obviously nationally and in other cities we've had lawsuits and they've had obviously these devastating shootings? Do you believe race relations are better here, and that as a result of your mayoralship in the 90s and the early 2000s, it sort of made things better in the greater Springfield
Well,
area?
I wouldn't give my administration credit, but I do think in general, things are better here in Massachusetts than they are in the South or in the Midwest. I believe that. I don't have any empirical data to back that up, but sensing as I go around the state, it seems to be better. Obviously, there's a long way to go. You know, I bring this question up when I interview nominees for judgeships. Why do we have so few women of color and men of color on in the judiciary sitting on the bench? And it's a question that really nobody can answer. But it gets back, I think, to discrimination, and people don't believe that they have a fair shot when they apply to be a judge, especially those of color. And right now we have like 7% of the judiciary is of color, and the population obviously is a lot higher than that. So we're trying to promote more diversity. So every step that you take as a young person, as a person in my status in life, you have to reach out and make sure that we create equal opportunity for all of our citizens. That's the only way we're going to get there.
Yeah. Another obviously big pressing issue, not only nationally, but even at the local level, what we've seen is gun control, gun issues, gun violence has happened. Obviously, this affects the law enforcement community as they probably see gun violence every single day. What do you want to do maybe as sheriff to bring down gun violence, bring more safety to maybe areas of high crime? What do you believe the sheriff's role should be in that, in preventing gun violence?
Well, two things, John. One, in 1997 and 1998, I worked with the Attorney General at the time, Scott Harshbarger, and Senator Cheryl Jakes, and we patterned the ban against assault weapons in Massachusetts, which still stands till today. So I was a co-sponsor of that legislation, and I'm very proud of it. I don't know why you need assault weapons. If you're a hunter, I don't know of any hunter that believes that an assault weapon is necessary for that sport. We've seen the devastation of assault weapons all over America, so I was very pleased with that legislation, that it stands intact today, although it is being assaulted somewhat by the NRA and GOL and other gun advocates, with the Attorney General taking the position that she has taken. The other thing I want to do is that on this 91 corridor going from New York to Maine, we know drugs and guns are coming up 91, but yet I don't see a regional response from the governors of all the states to put more resources into that corridor. So as sheriff, and I've already discussed this with Governor Baker, I'd like to lead the effort to coordinate that, bring the resources of local government, state government, federal resources, Homeland Security, and try and ramp it up so that we can control the flow of the drugs and guns that are coming up 91 all the way from New York to Maine. I think that's a reasonable strategy and a good position for the sheriff of Hamilton County to take.
And that'd be a strong objective inside your administration, getting that task force together, making sure those sort of areas between New York and Maine are stopped, and getting guns
Yeah, if
off
you
the
think
streets.
about it, it's a big area, but if you combine all the resources that I just outlined,
Yeah. Getting together
intelligence,
local leaders, the sheriff's
I
department,
think it
state.
could make a difference in stopping the flow and controlling it.
Mm-hmm.
And with the guns and the drugs, there's less violence. One of the other successful programs that I initiated as mayor was the gun buyback program. And we had several of them when I was mayor, where people would turn in their weapons. We'd get donations from the Big Y or some other local organization for gift cards, so they would turn in their weapons, and they would get a gift certificate. Now, a lot of the weapons were not usable; they were old. But it began the discussion of parents and kids that we got to get these weapons off the street. And then the churches kicked in, and it was successful to the point where we were taking some real weapons off the street. But that's got to be done consistently. It's got to be done on a monthly basis. You need corporate sponsorship as well. And I think these types of programs could make a difference in getting guns out of the hands of our kids.
Obviously, one of the other things that has sort of happened recently that many people, politicians, have really never faced before is obviously the explosion in social media and being able to connect with more people on a larger scale. You were obviously mayor a decade ago, but obviously technology has changed dramatically in that time period. As sheriff, how do you plan on connecting? I know you have a very prolific Facebook at Mike Albano. How do you plan on connecting with people connecting with people on social media?
Well, I have to tell you, that's the wave of the future, clearly, and it's the wave of what's going on right now in connecting. So it's a very fascinating and interesting question of how the Sheriff's Department could interact via social media to get prevention programs out, to get basic information out. I know politically it can be very, very successful in reaching people. So that most likely would be an area of concentration. I know people say that's not the traditional role of a sheriff. But again, I'm trying to think outside the box, and that would be one way to do it. The other things I want to do is early childhood education. Every study that I've read suggests that kids that are engaged in early childhood education programs, preschool programs, have a much better success at life. But yet, not every preschool slot is parents can send them to because the funding isn't available. The legislature tried to do something this past session. They fell a little bit short. But these are the types of programs that people say, that's not the role of the sheriff. I disagree. I disagree fundamentally that you take the political ability and authority that you have, you go to Boston, you go to Washington, you advocate for these types of programs. It's prevention. It's long-term prevention, but it's crime prevention. And I'd like to think of the sheriff in a more global way than my two distinguished opponents in getting involved in some of these areas. The reentry part of the sheriff's position, job, I think it's not easy, but in terms of the overall picture, I think it's fundamentally the easier part of reentry. Of course, you want to take somebody who's incarcerated and make them better people when they come out. You want them to address the causative factors. You want them to get involved in substance abuse counseling, education programming, job development. So when they come out, whether it's on parole or whether they complete their sentence, they're better people. That's a basic philosophy. These other areas that I want to get involved in, I think, are far more challenging.
Well, that concludes our interview with Mike Albano. I want to thank you, Counselor, for coming on today.
Thank you,
really
John.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I think we're all done.